Good morning. I'd like to welcome all of you to CSIS this morning, both those of you who are present and those of you who are watching by the live stream on our website. It's always a pleasure to open an event like this. This morning's program is a part of a series of presentations and work and research that we've been doing on the Caribbean, from the far north to the far south. This is an effort that Dr. George Fauriol has led over this past year and a half, along with a group of others, including David Lewis, who we'll be hearing from very soon. The Guyana Shield sub-region of South America that includes Guyana, French Guiana, and Suriname makes up one of the most interesting histories, I think, in the hemisphere. This territory that was located in between the Spanish and Portuguese colonial presence and which saw its component pieces traded back and forth among other European powers. This region is at a turning point of sorts, as it becomes clear that its already rich resources are more extensive than was once thought. Will the three states of the Guyana Shield take a common approach to this emerging development opportunity and seek economies of scale through cooperation? Will they succumb to the resource curse? Will they manage their development in a wise way? Will there be any meaningful sense of a common space, as implied by the term Guyana Shield, or will traditional geopolitics mean that their separate languages and border disputes will continue to divide them? How will their relationships change with their immediate neighbors, Brazil, Venezuela, and the Caribbean islands? These are some of the questions that we're going to be looking at this morning and over the next months. I'd first like to thank Jean-Yves Lacascade, who's one of our panelists, and David Lewis, CSIS Senior Associate, who first suggested this particular event a couple of months ago. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of Ambassador Badreising of Suriname, who's with us today, and I believe Ambassador Hintzen is going to be joining us a little bit later. We've also invited guests from the French Embassy. But without further ado, I'd like to turn the panel over to David Lewis. Thank you very much again for coming.
Thank you, Michael, and welcome everybody here and online. Just a few ground rules. I'll be moderating this first session. Each speaker is going to have approximately 12 minutes. I will very unprotocol-like interrupt you verbally when you have 3 minutes left, just so you know, rather than pass papers around and so on, which is a bit awkward. And I will also introduce each one in order of appearance, and that way we'll cut to the chase. Our first speaker is going to be Ambassador Henry Mcdonald, speaking from the Surinamese perspective. He is the current president of the World Development Foundation and is a former permanent representative of Suriname to the United Nations and a career diplomat with the Surinamese Foreign Service, having served here in Washington as well, way back when we didn't have so much traffic and so many new buildings and real estate booms, so kind of in the quieter years of Washington life. He'll be followed by Mr. Jean-Yves Lacascade. He is a research associate with the Center of Geopolitical and International Analysis at the University of the French Antilles and in Guadeloupe, and he's also serving as external advisor in the Territorial Collectivity of French Guiana, which is government of French Guiana, which is France as well in the Caribbean. And our third and final speaker is Professor Percy Hintzen from Florida International University, where he serves as Director of African and African Diaspora Studies and also affiliated with the Latin American Caribbean Center and Professor Emeritus with the University of California at Berkeley. Just let me add a couple of minutes of a few background to complement what Michael mentioned. I think we only have 4 universities left in the US that have geography departments. And coming from the Caribbean, I'm a big geography buff. Even those of us who are in international relations, sometimes we don't know, is Texas next to California or is it next to Massachusetts? And God forbid if you mention Guyana, where is that? So, but just to give a perspective, these 3 territories, since one is part of France and 2 are sovereign countries, as we mentioned in our commentary, which is online, cover about 180,000 square miles. That's just about over the size of California, to give you a sense of perspective. And if it were one joint geography in the world, it would be the 55th largest geography in the world. So we're talking about a real expansive side. My first visit to Guyana and Suriname was 1982, coming from other islands in the Caribbean. And I think it's fair to say anybody who goes to continental Caribbean territories, immediately you feel that you're not in an island anymore, but you are in the Caribbean. And the vastness and the impressiveness of geography just weighs on you. They're very diverse, because between the three of them, we barely make up 2 million people in these three territories, and also very diverse in terms of size, economically speaking. You're talking about GDPs which don't grow beyond 4 billion GDP, which is very small, even for small countries, and growth rates which, until recently with Guyana and Suriname, have also been very slow. And then, of course, you've got the big caveat that one of them is France and Europe in the Caribbean, with per capita incomes and standards of living and rules and regulations of Europe in the Caribbean. So just to give that sort of frame us, I will now pass on to each speaker. Ambassador McDonald, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And first of all, let me thank CSIS for inviting us and for inviting me to speak on a matter which I've been thinking about for, let's say 2-3 years, and writing also about it. And also, I'm honored to be with a member of this distinguished panel, and good morning to everybody. A zone for Southern Caribbean integration and regional cooperation as part of the Guyana Shield, Suriname, French Guiana, and Guyana. That's my title here. The term Guyana, or the Guyanas, is often used as a generic term for the three territories on the northern coast of South America. Suriname independent from Holland, the Netherlands. Guyana independent from Britain, Great Britain. And French Guiana, an overseas department of France, and thus an outermost region of the European Union. This geographical area of South America, together with the northern part of Brazil, the area of Amapá, a part of the northeast Colombia, and a part of East Venezuela is commonly referred to as the Guyana Shield. However, this morning we will focus on the three the smallest Eastern Caribbean territories, as I said, Suriname, French Guiana, and Guyana, as a potential zone for regional cooperation and sustainable development. The surface covered by these three countries, as was said, is roughly the size of the state of California. However, all of these three countries, these three Caribbean countries, or these three Caribbean territories, are 100% in the Shield. That's why we refer to them as such. If you ask me, I will say a very important part of this area, since this still contains one of the largest rainforests in the world and contains a wealth of natural resources such like oil, diamonds, bauxite, and gold. With regard to forest cover, the numbers are that Suriname is the greenest country on earth with 94% forest cover. Just recently I was talking to another expert and they said it was 93, so there's a little bit of a discussion. Is it now 94 or 93? French Guiana, which usually is not referred to as a country, but I studied the matter, and French Guiana is also covered by 94% of forest, and Guyana roughly 85. With the advance of increasing regionalism, there is growing recognition that the three Guyanas can strengthen their economic and social development by developing greater regional and functional cooperation. This sub-region of South America has not been largely studied in contemporary international relations literature on regional integration in Latin America and the Caribbean. That's why we decide to give it a shot and try to think and enter with you in a discussion about it. Moreover, it has not been specifically identified as a distinctive sub-region of cooperation in the world of intergovernmental regional organizations like the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, the Association of Caribbean States, the ACTO, the Amazon Cooperation Treaty, or the UN of South American Nations, UNASUR. Historically, the concept of Guyana Shield has been mostly used in the regional programs of cooperation in the area of the environment, in light of its rich biodiversity and its contribution to climate mitigation. The RED Plus for the Guyana Shield is a recent project funded by the EU, the French Guiana Regional Authority, and the French Global Environmental Facility. Just this year, at the 72nd regular session of the United Nations Assembly, to my understanding, it was the first time that any president spoke about the Guyana Shield. And on this occasion, it was the president of Guyana who called on the United Nations to help protect and preserve the entire Guyana Shield as a global resource for the survival and sustainability of our planet. He indicated that the Guyana Shield is critical to the mitigation of the greenhouse effect and is one of the world's largest remaining blocks of pristine rainforest in an era where climate change has become one of the major issues in the global agenda. Let me also remind that at the most recent visit of the French president to French Guiana, he also highlighted the increased potential of the Guyana Shield. The 3 Southern Caribbean territories have also been recognized for their potential for hydro energy production, agriculture development, and the promotion of sustainable tourism. With respect to energy, I can say that energy interconnection of the Shield may improve the regional electricity system, allowing electricity trading among the 3 territories, by which the region could use the cheapest and most effective source of energy, and I'm referring to hydro energy. The availability of arable land for agriculture production is plenty. However, risk models predict increased flooding, erosion, and saltwater intrusion in the coastal areas of French Guiana, Guyana, and Suriname, where currently 90% of all 3 countries' population resides, freshwater resources exist, and where most of the agriculture production occurs. If climate change continued with the current speed, the low-lying coastal areas will be wiped out in maybe 50 years. So you should, if you picture these 3 countries, 90% of the population live at this coastline. Suriname, Guyana, and French Guiana are among the lowest coastal zones in the world, and the threat is just severe. What does this mean for the Shield if climate change continues at the speed what is going now? Fertile land and freshwater resources will be compromised. Food will have to be produced elsewhere. Communities located in the most vulnerable areas will need to be relocated, and current and future sustainable tourism locations will be affected as well. Let me give you a good example. I went to Guyana this year 4 times. At night, if you drive through the East Coast where the dike is, at night you can see the waves sweeping over the dike. And this dike was extended by 2 feet. And it is just scary, just to imagine that you're driving on a street and the street is wet because water is going over the dike. And that is happening right now. I saw it with my own eyes. With regard, 3 minutes, okay, I'm finishing now. With regard to sustainable tourism development, this is the latest and most prevalent development potential of these territories. Sustainable tourism is currently the main income earner in the global tourism business sector, followed by conference beach, and lastly, cruise tourism. By the 1990s, tourism competed with oil as the world's largest legitimate business, and we know that today tourism is the world's #1 employer. The entire Guyana Shield is literally the greenest spot on the globe, and since green travel is presently the latest hype in the travel and tourism industry, it is up to the policymakers and the business community in these territories to attract socially conscious travelers and tourists. Suriname, Guyana, and French Guiana can open new and unexploited tourism destinations, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Mr. Lacascade.
Thank you very much, David. I would also like to thank CSIS for taking the initiative of organizing such an important subject. Basically, my perspective as an academic of the University of the French Antilles in Guadeloupe is to really provide a vision of the international relations context of French overseas territories in the Caribbean and in South America, and actually put it into the context of a possible development of increased interregional cooperation between Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana. French Guiana borders Suriname to the west through the Maroni River and Brazil to the east through the Oyapock River. As you can see, the interconnectivity is very important because today there's a big bridge that connects French Guiana and Brazil, and that connection was made possible after a meeting between French President Nicolas Sarkozy and ex-former President of Brazil, Mr. Cardoso. The French Guiana is an overseas region of France, thus being an integral part of the French Republic. So constitutionally, French Guiana is like an overseas province of France, and it will have a legal status comparable to what Hawaii is to the US. As you compare Puerto Rico, where I am from, Puerto Rico is an associated territory of the United States, but as an overseas territory, French Guiana is France, and thus, as being a French province, it is also a European Union overseas region. And the concept that the European Union uses to describe the overseas regions of Europe that are legally Europe, but geographically not Europe, it's called outermost regions or ultra-peripheral regions. So this is a very interesting concept because these territories are legally Europe, but are surrounded by independent countries that are either members of the ACP, which is the African Caribbean Pacific Group of States, are part of full members of regional organizations, and these overseas territories, if you wish, share a common geography, but constitutionally they're not members of these international organizations. The context of European presence in French Guiana is also highlighted by the fact that the European Space Agency is based in French Guiana. So basically, French Guiana has a very important role in the promotion of the space industry, and of course, its location also near the equator line is favorable to the development of this industry, European industry. The issue of regional cooperation among Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana highlights the policy issues of the external relations of these territories. And in such a way, what I want to explain to you is that the French government has recognized that the development of these overseas territories needs to integrate the fact that they are geographically in areas that are not France, and so there is an understanding that the development of these territories cannot be envisaged without closer regional relationships with their neighbors. So in this context, I'm going to present very quickly the legal framework that defines the boundaries of the external relations of the overseas territories like Guyana. So you have this, of course, started by our international conference between the different French territories in 1990 with former Prime Minister Michel Rocard. And progressively, there was a law voted in 2000, which is called the Orientation Law, that for the first time highlighted the international relations dimension of the French overseas territories, which basically allows the overseas French territories to engage into bilateral agreements with neighboring states, provided that those areas of cooperation are the competence of the territory in itself, because these territories have now regional assemblies that govern these territories by electoral votes of people, and there's also a presence of the French prefect. The overseas territories can also become associate members or observers of international organizations in their immediate geographic. So in this sense, French Guiana has formally introduced a request to become associate member of CARICOM, as well as associate member of the the UN Commission for Latin American and Caribbean, ECLAC. Other French territories, like Martinique, became associate member for the first time of an organization called the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. So which is historical because normally the Caribbean regional organizations are composed of independent countries and British overseas territories. So this is the first time that a French overseas territory becomes a full associate member of a regional organization. So based on that precedent, we can also imagine French Guiana becoming an associate member of CARICOM and associate members of regional organizations where the legal status of that organization would allow associate membership. Another important fact that I wanted to highlight is that the European Union has also crafted a policy towards the outermost regions. And in this context, the President of the European Commission, Monsieur Juncker, was recently in French Guiana together with the French President Macron, which gives you an idea of the strategic importance that is given to French Guiana. And one of the key pillars of the European Union strategy, which was adopted on the 24th of October, is about regional cooperation of the outermost regions. So this concept will be directly applicable to the regional cooperation prospects between Suriname, Guyana, and French Guiana cooperation. And in that sense, the neighbor countries like Suriname and Guyana are also members of other development cooperation programs and the treaty that relates the links between Europe and the Caribbean, mostly known as Cotonou Agreement. And in that sense, the group of Caribbean countries that are part of the relationship of Europe, better known as CARIFORUM, the CARIFORUM also recognizes the importance of developing regional cooperation programs with the French outermost regions, and in such a way, the funding from Europe could be used to fund joint programs between these three territories. So in the sense, the European Union uses the European Development Fund, EDF, to fund activities in independent Caribbean countries, and French Guiana, being a region of Europe, has an instrument called the European Union Regional Fund, which in English is called ERDF, which is the fund that European Union provides for the poorest regions of Europe to allow them to reach the level of cohesion that you have in Europe in general. So in a sense, French Guiana, for the purposes of European Union, is both a European territory, but also a European territory that can cooperate with neighboring independent countries. So in that stance, the European Union has an instrument called Interreg, which is an interregional program, and there's a specific Interreg program for the Amazonian French continental relationship, and another Interreg for the Caribbean. So it's very interesting that the European Union has already recognized the prospects for interregional development between the three Guyanas. So in that sense, I also want to conclude by presenting the recent law that the French Assembly voted on last year, which is called the External Action Law for the Overseas Territories. And this is I want to highlight the importance of this, because in such a way, this is the first time, and this was a concept exposed by former French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius, who talked about the concept of territorial diplomacy. In other words, it's a recognition that the territories of France in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, in Africa, and in the Caribbean, French, in South America, can actually develop regional relations in order to enhance the concept of regional integration and regional collaboration between these overseas territories. So, as a conclusion, I wanted to say that the French legal context to engage into regional collaboration, so far international relations, it's absolutely possible today. And I believe with this example of this zone of cooperation, it is totally envisageable from a legal perspective that French Guyana can be more active in developing regional collaborations within its immediate neighborhood. I would like to thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean-Yves. Professor Hintzen?
Good morning. I'd like to thank CSIS for organizing this very important and significant conference, and also to be the institution that will be probably one of the major institutions that focuses on the Caribbean. And when I say the Caribbean, I mean the greater Caribbean, not only what I call the insular Caribbean, but also the Caribbean from Mexico all the way to sort of Brazil. It's very, very important, I think. But particularly the insular Caribbean, primarily because, to a certain extent, because of their small size and their lack of integration with the broader region for colonial and historical reasons, are probably the most non-viable to a certain extent. I'm going to speak from the perspective of my own concern. And I think the idea of Guyana Shield, with which I am not necessarily as familiar as the experts, but I see it as an aspirational concept. And it's aspirational, and the term shield becomes very, very important. Because there are a number of crises that the world is facing. And these crises are very, very historical. First of all, the crises of biodiversity and the threat to biodiversity, climate change, which is very, very important, resource depletion, which is very, very important. The crises of what we might call the geopolitical system in international relations, where we're beginning to see the non-viability and dangers of the state system to a certain extent. And I think that particularly in the three countries that are named, Guyana, my country, Suriname, and French Guiana, we are beginning to see the consequences of these crises, particularly the consequences immediately emerging from global sea rise, and the threat to biodiversity on the one hand, and also the crises that have been a legacy of the colonial system, with which I include the Westphalian state system, and the disentanglement and the disorganization of regions that should necessarily be naturally integrated, not only geographically, but politically, economically, et cetera, et cetera. So let's put this in context. I mean, we are talking about Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana. 3 countries that speak 3 languages. 3 countries that, notwithstanding the fact that they were integrated at the beginning of the 19th century, have virtually little to do with each other. And also, they are part of the Guyana Shield region, which is a geographical region. You know, it was instantiated by geography, and it is constituted by Brazil, parts of Colombia, parts of French Guiana, part of Suriname, and part of Venezuela. You know, it's a natural ecosystem, and it's one of the most biodiverse systems in the world. And it has, because of the poverty, so to speak, poverty has been a savior to a certain extent, because it has not been developed, and it has now become the savior primarily because it has the most intact biodiverse regions. It has the most intact biodiverse resources in the world. It is also very much part and parcel of the lungs of the world. You know, and consequently, we have to begin to think of it politically, economically, socially, and even culturally, given the presence of indigenous populations, as one reality. We have to begin to think about it as one reality. Now, let me go back to Guyana, right? My country, Guyana, is as big as Great Britain. But yet it has, at the moment, less than 800,000 people. Less than 800,000 people. It is buffeted, it has tremendous resources, and there has been a struggle to preserve the forest resources, primarily because of the intervention of timber companies. It also has a number of resources that have not been developed, and hopefully we'll have to begin to think about that. And it also has particularly a number of border disputes that are part and parcel of the colonial legacy. We have a border dispute that has recently been sort of settled with Suriname, and we have a continuing border dispute with Venezuela. And that has affected our capacity and capabilities to use our resources to our betterment. Guyana has been, and I'm not sure that this is true, but Guyana has been named as the 2nd poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. And I think this is a travesty. I mean, it has everything. At the end of the 1950s, Guyana was the country, British Guyana at the time, was the country that was targeted to be the country with the most prospects for development. Because it has everything. It has a small population, it has biodiversity, it has everything. And yet we have been unable to do that. So I think that in terms of in aspirational terms, you know, I think that when we begin to think about the shield, what we have to begin to think about is, what are we shielding against? What are the aspirations that this area, you know, would shield against? And I think, first of all, it is an area that should shield against the crisis of biodiversity and resource depletion, and the crisis of global sea rise. You know, we have to begin to think about that. And we have to think about the consequences that if some of the most intact rainforests in the world, and the region where we have some of the most biodiverse resources in the world, if that is under threat, then the global system is under threat. And it is not going to be resolved until we begin to think about new systems of political economy, new systems of political order that move away significantly from the Westphalian system that has imposed colonial borders on our countries. Now, this may seem to be a pie in the sky, But the region in the world that has moved away significantly from these state-defined realities is the very region that invented it, and that is Europe. The European Union, despite all of their linguistic diversity, despite all of the histories, despite everything else, has decided that it is going to reorganize and reorient its geopolitical system into an EU that has been extraordinarily successful. It has been, the EU is one of the most successful regions in the world, and it has been able to overcome conflicts and crises that we have not seen in our area. You know, they've had wars for centuries. And we've had the First World War, the Second World War, now we have issues, and the European Union has been a shield, has shielded itself against that. Notwithstanding the diversity, the linguistic diversity, which is even more than the linguistic diversity in the Caribbean and Latin America. It is even more than that. The other country, I think, that has successfully used global regional networks is China. The reason why China became very, very important and powerful is that it used its regional networks in East and Southeast Asia to coordinate the economic development and all the other types of, and even the political order. It has used that to its own benefit. So I think that we in the Caribbean will have to begin to, and Latin America, have to begin to think of ourselves as part of a larger region. And that larger region is Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think that we have to begin to think about natural boundaries, the natural realities. What is it naturally that should organize and order our geopolitical system and our policies? Because I do not necessarily think that Guyana, my country, could survive if we continue the legacies of colonialism that have separated us from our natural realities. And I think it is incumbent upon the entire world to begin to rethink of this order and organization. I think so. We have Venezuela, and Venezuela claims 2/3 of the territory of Guyana. The reason why Suriname and Guyana has attempted to sort of resolve its border issue, quite frankly, has to do with oil. It has to do with oil. Now, and I'm not sure why it had to take the possibility of riches which may not necessarily come to pass to resolve a crisis which is much more fundamental than this. And unfortunately, I'm from Guyana, and Guyana is an English-speaking country. And persons who speak English think that they don't need to communicate with persons anywhere else. So when we go to Suriname, the Surinamese speak English. When we go to French Guiana, the French Guyanese speak English. And when we go to China, they speak English. When we go to Brazil, I don't know. However, they're learning to speak English. But they're a big and powerful country, and they could speak whatever the hell they want to speak. You know what I mean? They could get by without speaking English, but we cannot get by without speaking Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Dutch. We can't. And yet we hear over and over and over again that these linguistic differences, these colonial differences, we are aligned and allied, with different colonial poles. We hear these as reasons for not being able to resolve this aspirational problem of the Guyana Shield.
Percy, 3 minutes.
So here's my solution. No. My solution is this. Well, for Guyana, I think that Guyana could very well be the beneficiary, a major beneficiary of this initiative. Because if this, in the short run, if this initiative allows Guyana to become engaged much more with France, basically through an initiative where the French presence is there, in the case of the dams, and to become much more engaged with Holland, which was the country that when we're speaking about the three, the three countries, the country that we inherited from, I think it would be enormously beneficial. But I also think it becomes very, very important for us to be engaged with Venezuela, with Brazil, and to have Brazil assist us with the crisis and the problem we have with Venezuela. And of course, there is also the China-Brazil relationship through the BRICS. Brazil is now not doing so well, but there's a strong China-Brazil relationship with the BRICS. And that relationship has paid dividends, has begun to pay dividends for Guyana. Brazil had plans to develop a 200 megawatt electricity generating plant. Some of it would be used for Guyana, and the rest of it would be used for northern Brazil. They were developing a port in order to get their stuff out of northern Brazil, which also tells you the problem of these boundaries. They have to sort of negotiate to get their goods out from northern Brazil. And also, hopefully, become much more part and parcel. These relationships would bring us much more part and parcel with our connections to Africa, to China, to India, and to have us part of a much more global dialogue on how the geopolitical Westphalian post-colonial system is not working. And I think that because it's not going to be, we're going to be here 100 years from now talking about the Guyana Shield and why it is that Guyana and Suriname and Brazil and Venezuela and et cetera. So I think we have to begin to think about the big picture as opposed to thinking about whether or not Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana could sort of negotiate themselves out of the crisis. And that's not going to happen because the crisis is bigger than we think. And that's my contribution from someone who knows very little about the Guyana Shield. Sorry.
Well, thank you very much. We're right on time for questions and answers. I just want to throw out a couple of issues to start off and then open for the audience and for comments from all or any of you. Clearly, there's symmetries and asymmetries between the three territories, geographic, ecological, and geological symmetries in terms of what the Guyana Shield concept means, particularly with international organizations, governments, regional cooperation, as has been discussed, and obviously development cooperation issues. But on the other hand, we have some serious social, economic, and political asymmetries between the three, affecting things like territoriality, borders, governance issues, and now economic development, particularly with the boom in the extractive industry sectors, which brings in not only the governments and international organizations, but non-state, particularly corporate actors in the world of energy, minerals, and so on. So I'm curious if we could start off with comments from each one of you on how you perceive that from each of the three countries in terms of the deficits and also the assets for advancing that. And since your light is on already, Percy, why don't you just start off with that, and then we'll work towards this end, a couple of minutes each, and then we'll open up for questions and answers.
Is my light on? Yeah. Well, that's a very, very difficult question because, from my perspective on Guyana, at one point, Guyana was one of the three countries that was producing 90% of the world's bauxite. Mm-hmm. You know, Suriname was one, Jamaica was another. And it produced extraordinary wealth for the rest of the world. It didn't produce any wealth for us. It didn't produce any wealth for Jamaica. And I'll ask the ambassador whether he thought it produced wealth for Suriname. I don't know, you know, but it doesn't seem so to me. Guyana produces a phenomenal amount of gold. But there's a cross-border issue. You know, we have, on the one hand, companies from Canada and elsewhere who are benefiting from the gold, and we are not. You know, we have kaolin. And of course, you know, we produce sugar when sugar was the oil of the world. The Brazilians are very, very actively involved in Guyana and in Suriname, and I think in French Guiana, in terms of extraction, the extraction of gold. And there has been an incapacity to control the extraction of gold, as there has been an incapacity to control the extraction of anything to the benefit of the country. So I'm not sure how we resolve these issues. And I do not see a resolution to rest in trilateral or multilateral or bilateral arrangements. I really don't see it, because if it were the case that we were to benefit from the resources, and I mean, one of the biggest developmental projects that the world saw during the 19th century was the empolderization of Guyana. You know, that was a massive project. The Dutch used it, but so we can't say that we did not have developmental resources. You know, there's an issue where Barama, a company that extracted our timber resources, had phenomenally more electricity generating power. I think it was like over 10 times the amount of electricity generating power than Guyana. And at a time when we were seeing blackouts, you know, you could see bright spots in the Barama area. You know, so it is not a question of the absence of foreign direct investments. There have been foreign direct investments in Guyana. And when foreign direct investments were affected, they instituted mechanisms basically for us to resolve those problems, as they have for us to resolve the issue of borders vis-a-vis oil.
Okay, so concern and not as optimistic, I'd say.
No.
Jean-Yves?
Well, I think I've been in the business of regionalism for many, many years, and it's clearly a notion that tend to be difficult to implement in terms of putting together common programs, common projects. But in terms of the increasing globalization, I cannot see, for example, Suriname, Guyana, and French Guiana sharing a common area and not putting together common strategies to highlight the problem of biodiversity and climate change. From a personal perspective, I used to be diplomatic advisor to the president of Martinique, and I saw at the time how effective Martinique played a role in convincing former French President François Hollande to take up the agenda of COP21 for the Caribbean. And actually, France was chairing the COP21, and we were able to organize a major summit on climate change in Martinique, where we had all the heads of state of CARICOM, together with the French president, who was really at the top of the activity. And I can assure you that the Caribbean agenda was made more easily influenced in the COP21 thanks to France, And even we even had a Caribbean pavilion at the COP21 summit in France, and I was there. And I can see how much the Caribbean, especially in the context of European Union external policies, where with Brexit, we are going to lose a major friend of Europe for the Caribbean. And I think that this change in geopolitical concept may play a role where being, let's say, brothers from a similar sub-region, then we can actually help advance our agendas at the global level. At the same time, as Professor Hintzen was mentioning, the fact of developing inter-university collaboration between the three Guyanas, you will have an excellent opportunity to develop diplomats, business people that will understand the language spoken in Suriname, which is Dutch, the language spoken in French Guiana, which is French, and English. And today, that's not something that is necessarily maximized. So I think through regional schemes at mini Erasmus, where you can have that inter-university collaboration, that's very, very important. You have also the fact of business development. The business development within the three territories can also be enhanced by having a common understanding of the trading rules and between those three countries. And at the same time, a status of associate membership for French Guiana would also allow the CARICOM to better, help the development of other functional cooperation schemes, like in natural disaster prevention, whether it's in common matters of security. So I tend to be still naively optimistic that the regionalism dimension will certainly help increase the economic and social development, and at the same time acknowledging that the three territories have also minerals and other natural resources that can also be developed to develop more environmentally sensitive production by exchanging technologies, by exchanging common practice. And so this is a very hard thing to develop, but I believe that functional cooperation is a fundamental aspect of the increased development of what we call inter-regional collaboration. And the fact that some external donors are willing to support those programs, I think this is an opportunity that could be very positive for the development of the three territories. Thank you.
Thank you. Very quick. I'm totally into creating a common regional strategy of the Southern Caribbean countries as we are discussing here. Let me illustrate it with an example while I'm so optimistic. I've been studying reading, looking into it, the issue of tourism, sustainable tourism in our region. What we have in common is, of course, the rainforest. But when you look at these three separate countries, they are very interesting. For instance, Suriname is the only Dutch-speaking country in the world outside Europe. The capital of Suriname, Paramaribo, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So that is very interesting. When you go to Guyana, you will see that Guyana has with regard to rainforest tourism, or beauty of the rainforest, if you ask me, Guyana is number one of these three countries. They have the Kaitour Falls. The Kaitour Falls is the single biggest highest drop waterfall in the world. I don't know how you explain it, but to give you an idea, many of us has been in the what is this big waterfall in New York, Niagara Falls. Kaitour Falls is 4 times that size. The Essequibo River, the mouth of the Essequibo River, the ambassador of Guyana explained to me in New York that is the size of the state of Barbados, full of islands. The Tepuis. So there are things that are so amazing, but nothing is happening with regard to tourism. French Guiana, I know that all European satellites and satellites from African countries, Brazil, Latin America, South American countries, are being launched from French Guiana. So there is so much potential there. But right now, we are not yet in the situation where we are creating a kind of strategy how to develop these unique things that we have. We can be proud of them. We are not doing that yet. But with kinds of these activities, I think that we will get there. The more you talk about it, and at one point, I think that I hope that in a few years from now, I will have other talks about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we've got about 15 minutes for audience. If you will take please give me your name and then your question, if it's directed to someone specifically. And if you have statements, keep them for afterwards. I think we have someone here, Nikki. Anyone else?
Hi, I'm Jim Baker, and I work as a consultant for the UN FAO. And a few years ago, I was involved with President Barack Jagdeo in working with his low-carbon development plan, and the fact that he was able to get a significant funding from Norway for reducing deforestation. And I just wondered if that low-carbon development plan that he put together is one of the things that might be used as a basis for the regional cooperation.
Absolutely. You know, but I think it cannot work if all the countries who have a vested interest in forest maintenance are involved. And we know there's been a history of Brazil. Brazil has, you know, the World Bank had to sort of reverse with Brazil the forest deforestation in Brazil, and I think that worked very, very well. But there are. And here again, you know, I think it's very, very important for what we might call the non-governmental organizations, meaning the non-state, the non-bilateral institutions to sort of participate, and they have done a phenomenal job. And I think the environmental group, you know, has done, and the FAO and other UN agencies have and the World Bank to a certain extent vis-a-vis, you know, biodiversity, and of course we have the climate change. I think that these are the things that we have to begin to focus on, and when we focus on the maintenance of the tropical forest, then we have to begin to think differently about how we go about it, as opposed to saying, well, you know, Jagdeo is going to do this, but then the Brazilians we don't know, the Venezuelans we don't know, you know, the Surinamese, yeah, perhaps, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that this is, you know, this is sort of a global initiative. And here's where the UN becomes very, very important, because I think the UN thinks much more globally. Some UN agencies think much more globally, and they see the problem from 30,000 feet as opposed to 1 foot.
Just add to that, already working on quote-unquote Guyana Shield initiatives. You've got UN agencies, EU agencies, the Smithsonian has a biological diversity project, the World Wildlife Federation has an initiative, so there's clearly a lot of things going on. That's just in the sort of development, international organization world. I mean, if we add to non-state actors what's happening with the corporate world, mining companies, oil companies, gas companies in the 3 countries, you're really looking at a universe of players that there's at least an argument for some minimum coordination because of the cross-border issues.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Paul Spencer from the Organization of American States. I seem to be hearing 2 positions being posited. One is that the 3 Guyana Shield members represented here should strengthen and broaden the relationship with Latin America. And of course, we know Suriname, Guyana, members of UNISO, which has not been mentioned specifically in this conversation, and I do not know what's the status of French Guiana in that respect. And the other position is that using French Guiana the Guyana Shield countries should enhance their relationship with the countries of Europe, take advantages of all the different cooperation arrangements to be had in that respect. And the other thing which has not been mentioned is the big elephant in the room, the position of the United States. Is it going to, be on the, outside looking in, or the inside looking in? Thank you.
Thank you so much, my dear friend. We know each other from my OAS time. Very interesting, because these are the things which we need to think about. As I said, that cooperation, the regional cooperation between these three countries is coming up. But I was, for a short time, the permanent representative, not the permanent, I was the director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And during that time, which was a very short time, but I was involved with the ministry with negotiations with the two neighbors. But I cannot recall in that very short time that we had meetings where these three countries were sitting together in a room and strategizing about anything. We were either talking with the French or talking with the Guyanese. So these are the things which we need to think about. How will we create regional strategies? And that's why this is one of the first. Maybe there are more, because I've been quite a while at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but I'm not aware of strategizing meetings on anything where we have been sitting together with these three countries and develop a certain strategy, a regional strategy. So thank you very much for the question, and it's starting to think about these things. I don't know if Shani.
Yeah, let me, they're not mutually exclusive. And in fact, what is happening now, there's a big EU CLAC initiative, right? And I think that answers the third part of your question. I think that the resolution to our problems, in the Caribbean and Latin American region is to intensify our relationship with the EU and to try to find an alternative to the legacy of the Monroe Doctrine. You see? And I think that is the direction that Europe is going in, particularly through EU, with this relationship with EU CLAC and with the presence of CARIFORUM, for example, which is the ACP reality in the region. And they're actually trying to sort of push the Latin American and Caribbean countries, into re-specifying their regional relationships. And I think it's mutually beneficial for both of these regions, primarily because of the fundamental changes in the global political economy. And it's beneficial for us in the EU LAC region, and in the LAC region, and it's beneficial for Europe. And I think, this is what we have to sort of begin to think about, a bi-regional relationship between the EU and Latin America and the Caribbean on grounds that are fundamentally different from grounds from basically the Monroe Doctrine and that intensified in the post-World War II era.
Yes, just a quick reaction. It's important to note that the European Union has developed financing mechanism called the Amazonian Cooperation Program that actually has almost 20 million euros to facilitate the development of common projects between French Guiana, Guyana and Suriname and the northern part of Brazil. And at the same time, if you want to bring this thought further, as Professor Hintzen was mentioning, in the context of the EU-CELAC development cooperation dimension, from the legal eligibility criteria, French Guiana could be a lead project presenter because French Guiana would be part of the EU funding mechanism, so you don't have to necessarily do it with continental Europe. So in such a way, French Guiana could also facilitate the implementation through its territorial diplomacy. It could facilitate the implementation of common programs defined, of course, by the three countries and territories, that you could really have a common strategy defined by the countries, defined by the territory, for the betterment of the people. And I think this is a perfect example whereby, as you said, the president of the European Commission was in French Guiana 2 weeks ago, the French president. So you really have there a mechanism of influence that can be essential for the developing of common projects between the three neighboring countries.
Thank you. Let's just take I think we had 2 hands. If we can take them both, and then over here, and then over here, and we'll finish off.
Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your presentations. I'm Alexander Coswell. I'm a Jamaican graduate student at Georgetown and a research intern at CSIS. I'm glad Professor Hintzen brought up the issue of the border dispute with Venezuela. Since the discoveries of the oil and gas reserves off the coast of Guyana has more or less coincided with the crisis in Venezuela. I've read a lot of op-ed pieces since the beginning of the year about the possible implications of an increasingly desperate Venezuelan regime and their claim on 2/3 of Guyana. So my question is simple for the panel: with a defense cooperation in this integration?
Okay, over here, and then Ambassador Insonali.
Good morning. Enrique Ortiz from the Andes Amazon Fund. The question is about the findings of oil in the coast of Guyana. How to prevent that the oil doesn't become a curse and more a motor of development, particularly on environmental issues that Guyana and the rest of the countries in the Guyana Shield are facing.
Okay, Ambassador.
Thank you. Riyad Insonali, Ambassador of Guyana, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to speak a little longer because there's some misconceptions that I didn't expect our experts to raise. And first of all, Guyana is an island surrounded by land. Jean-Yves, you might remember that Norman Garvan liked to quip that we were there on the northern coast of South America and were relatively isolated. But because of that, or because of that perception, Guyana has always been very strong on regional cooperation and regional integration. We're one of the founding members of CARICOM. The CARICOM Secretariat is in Guyana. We're a founding member of the ACS, which I'm surprised you didn't mention, Jean-Yves. And we have been deeply involved in UNASUR, CELAC, the OAS, of course. But regional integration is important to Guyana, first point. Brazil has always been respectful of Guyana's borders and has been very supportive of Guyana's borders. We have a good relationship with Brazil. We don't have disputes with Venezuela. Venezuela claims 2/3 of our territory is not a dispute. It's a controversy arising from their claim that the 1899 full, final, and perfect settlement is null and void. And that matter is before the UN Secretary General in a process of dialogue. And today, as we speak, my foreign minister is meeting with his counterpart with the UN facilitator, and we are pressing for our matter to go before the International Court of Justice. We believe in the rule of international law, we believe in multilateralism, and those are the routes we will continue to pursue. Venezuela doesn't want to go to court. You form your own conclusions with regard to that position, but we fully believe in our case, and we're prepared to go to court. I was pleased to hear about your optimism regarding our relationship with our neighbors, Suriname. I'm not aware of a great deal of progress, but I'm ever optimistic myself. And I know my friend Ambassador Badri Singh is here, and we can work to resolve those issues, but they are issues. Let us not be complacent. They are issues. Regional cooperation, therefore, is an excellent vehicle for addressing those issues. We actually have a great interest in the Guyana Shield, as noted in the handout. Our president spoke about the Guyana Shield at the UN General Assembly, and this is a development from the low carbon development strategy. We have a green state development strategy which incorporates elements of the LCDS. and is actually more ambitious, if anything. And we see the Guyana Shield as being an integral part of that strategy in cooperation with our neighbors. Now, I'm not sanguine about the prospects of French Guiana becoming a member of CARICOM. And that's why I'm surprised you didn't mention the ACS, because Suriname, French Guiana, along with the other French DOMs, Guyana and the rest of the Caribbean, sit in the ACS together. And that would be a vehicle, I would imagine, for deeper cooperation. And I seem to remember 15 years ago, you did mention Interreg 3 in the context of the ACS, and were promoting it then. So I'm surprised you didn't raise that here, and I'm also surprised that there's been no progress since then. There's a lot of scope for cooperation with the European Union through the ACP, through CARICOM, CARIFORUM, through the ACS. And yes, we should try to develop those linkages further, but it requires a lot more thought, which brings me to what I suppose is a question I should ask. And why are we having this conversation here? Why not in the region? Why not in, with our policymakers there, as opposed to a room full of very interested people whose interests I welcome, and people with whom we will cooperate and with whom we are cooperating. I see this as a good step forward based on the renewal of the Caribbean program at CSIS, going back to last year when I had the honor and privilege of making a presentation in Guyana, and there were follow-up discussions. But really, we have to see where this is taking us. It's a good talk, it's a good conversation, but what are the next steps, and what do you hope to get out of this? I heard talk about a proposal, but I'm not clear what the proposal is. Thank you. I'm sorry to go on for so long.
Ambassador, no, thank you for joining us. We've actually got 2 minutes before we need to close for the next panel. So we had 3 questions. They were very direct. If we just go through each of you very quickly, any one of them you want to answer, and then we close off. Percy?
Yeah, Guyana has been very much involved with regional cooperation, and there's a practical reason why. You know, first of all, we were the founding members of one of the founding members of CARICOM, and we have a vested interest there. We are significant in CARIFORUM. In fact, you know, our former ambassador is now the Secretary General of ACP. And we've had good relations with Brazil. The problem is the resilience and the effectiveness of these relations. And I think that we have to begin to expand, you know, our understanding of regionalism. And we have to seek other mechanisms, because CARICOM, for all intents and purposes, and CARIFORUM, for all intents and purposes, you know, happen to be organizations of recent colonial presences. And there are tensions between the non-Spanish and Portuguese-speaking countries and these countries as well. So I think we have to begin to reformulate, you know, our understanding of what regionalism is, in order for it to be functional and to develop the mechanisms to bring that reformulation into practical reality.
Jean-Yves?
Yes, basically the whole idea is just to demonstrate the value added of common cooperation on subjects of common interest. So in the sense, it's correct. The ACS is also another mechanism whereby France is an associate member on behalf, originally on behalf of the 3 territories, and now you have Guadeloupe and Martinique who are associate member on their own. And of course, ACS is a perfect mechanism to foster this sub-regional cooperation. In the same time, I think that what it was important to show is that the the fact that the outermost regions are so much integrated in this policy that the EU wants to develop. So I was just simply wanted to show that that legal framework could be perfectly applicable, both in terms of the opportunities and both in terms of the instruments. So in that sense, it's clear that that potential is there. There is tremendous political support for the concept of regional cooperation. It's just getting that cooperation implemented in such a way that you could see common programs into universities, tourism. But definitely, Riyad, you're right. The ACS is another mechanism that can be extremely positive to develop common programs between the three Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana.
Really short, Ambassador, thank you very much for your question. Why are we doing it here? And that's why at the beginning I thank CSIS for starting this discussion. I would like to see this entire discussion be moved back home. So that should be the next step. We should think about that and we should discuss that. But that's the reason why, because we three have been talking about this for a while, and it is really fortunate that Surinamese, Guyanese, and French Guyanese, have been getting involved in this matter. And we got the opportunity from CSIS to I'm not going to say launch, but to start up the discussion here, and we would like to see it, be moved back home. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So if you'll all join me in thanking the speakers, and we'll move quickly for the second panel. Thank you so much. Très bon.
Très bon. Going.
Very good, Percy. Thank you. Good job. Thank you. All right.
Oh, yeah. Yes. No, absolutely. Yeah. I have this as one of my.
Did you have a seat? Since I'm standing in your way. Yeah, that was definitely interesting. Yeah, it was funny. All right. No, I think you got. I don't know. That's one we're missing. Okay. Maybe Rand's a little boy. I think I have. I like your critical as well as cynical. I know. That's very good. I think I brought my wife. This is about art, but it's the same. Thank you very much. Is he here? Yeah. There's no way I can respond to all of that in 5 minutes.
I know. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm in your thing. Okay.
Oh my goodness. Where's Rand?
All right, why don't we quickly continue this conversation. My name is George Fauriol. I'm a senior associate here at CSIS. The first panel discussion underscores a number of features, and obviously, as noted by one of the panelists, talks this in sort of aspirational terms. The Guyana Shield as a concept clearly has a lot of potential. It may not be, to go to the Guyanese ambassador's pointed question, it may not be very well known here in Washington, but I would argue that it's probably something that needs to be discussed further, not only here, but obviously in the region itself. There are a number of key issues that were brought up, and what I'd like to do with this panel here of sort of get additional views and observations about the Guyana Shield idea. We have three, I think I'm going to take them in the reverse order of which they are seated here. We'll start with Randy Persaud, who is an associate professor at School of International Service at American University. Moved to Jason Calder, who until very recently was the field office director for the Carter Center Election Observation Mission in Guyana. And last but not least, Scott McDonald, also a senior associate at CSIS, wears a number of other hats, works mostly in the economic field of study. And by the way, in addition to the piece that was posted by CSIS on the Guyana Shield concept yesterday, there's another piece on Suriname specifically posted by from Scott. Let me throw out a couple quick observations and then move on to the three additional commentaries. First, the emergence of this kind of regional concept idea obviously builds on the Caribbean's own long history, as was mentioned earlier, of integrative efforts. CARICOM and particularly the ACS states mentioned several times in the earlier discussion. But I think most of our observers may also conclude that these efforts and other regional Caribbean efforts have perhaps been lacking in substantive accomplishments, although they certainly have generated a fair amount of institutionalization for the Caribbean region. And nonetheless, I think these are the kinds of experiences that the Caribbean, that the Guyana Shield concept ultimately can build on and work from. Clearly, the potential cooperative aspect that is implied by the Guyana Shield idea also is going to be faced with a number of challenges because it attempts to bring together issues that normally are in fact at odds with each other and generate opposing views. On the one hand, sort of environmental cooperation issues, climate change, and on the other, extractive industry and energy development. So these are not going to be easy issues to resolve, but clearly the Guyana Shield concept in some ways forces everyone to look at this from a common perspective. Secondly, and maybe paradoxically, the Guyana Shield concept maybe gives credence to the notion that the Caribbean operates at different speeds. And while it is very helpful to look at the region as a whole, there's a certain unity that is helpful in talking about the region. But as a practical matter, there's also probably a need to recognize that the future of the Caribbean may be best viewed when looked at it from a sub-regional functional perspective. And the Guyana Shield idea, in fact, is a perfect example of that. And therefore, maybe the locus, if you will, of policy attention to the region moving forward may be best looked at when you look at these sub-regional concepts. You can envision varying versions of that, looking at the northern Caribbean from Puerto Rico to Jamaica. And finally, a third sort of observation is that this nexus, as I said earlier, of sustainable environmental issues with the emergence of energy resource potential is going to place a considerable strain on various layers of governance questions, both economic and political governance, particularly in Guyana and in Suriname, but across the entire region as a whole. And therefore, clearly invites, and this is where I think there's some utility in having a meeting in Washington, clearly invites a sequencing, thinking through a little bit the sequencing of interaction when it comes to the roles of governments, of international financial institutions, let alone private sector investors. Plus, as was highlighted in the first panel, the fact that built into the Guyana Shield concept is in fact an invitation for an unusually expansive role of the various mechanisms that are represented by the EU. A lot of layers, a lot of complexity, a lot of players that ultimately need to synchronize some of their actions to make this idea very productive. Again, I think the exciting part of the Guyana Shield concept is it's aspirational and invites lots of interesting ideas. So I think we certainly welcome and excited about the discussion here today. Let me quickly move to the three panelists. We'll provide additional commentaries, and then hopefully we have a few more minutes to take up some questions from you, from the audience. Why don't we start with Randy? Randy?
Thank you very much, and I thank CSIS for doing this. For the second time I'm here, I'm really happy to be a part of this, and I thank the panel before us for thoughtful observations. States, especially small states, cooperate because they have to. It's the nature of the Westphalian system, and if you don't cooperate and belong to something larger than yourself, it is very difficult for you to function effectively in an interstate system, including in multilateral fora. The analysis, however, of integration need not begin at the level of states. A long time ago, it was established that analysis of international phenomena can be at the systemic level, at the state level, or at the societal level. So I want to go and take the more sociological approach and start at the societal level. And I argue, actually, that there is already fairly deep integration that's been there for quite some time. But you can only recognize that if you go below the state and go to the level of the people. And economic cooperation can happen at the state level in formal terms. But I want to suggest to you that there has been an informal regime of economic transactions based on an expanded informal economy. During the 1970s and the 1980s, traders, especially from Guyana, went to Suriname, they went to Brazil, and they went to Venezuela, and they came back to the villages and to the cities, and they became the backbone of providing basic necessities. It's been thoroughly documented. So perhaps we can begin with the informal economy and begin at the level of people-to-people contact and then work upwards. Diplomacy is almost always about people, although they are organized by states. And I think we have to establish a proper balance here. So let me say then that there has been a transactional, low-level cooperation that is well established at the level of society. Evidence is an important thing when general claims are made. And so I want to share just quickly with you a survey I did. I actually was born and raised in a Dutch village, went to a high school that is named after the Dutch presence there, Cornelia Ida, which is on the west coast of Damar, for those of you who know Guyana and have been there. So I went there in 2006, and I mapped out the village and put every single house that was there in 1974. And then in 2006, I sat down with 3 other villagers, and we were able to identify every single villager where they were if they had not died. 1,154 people were living there in 1974. In 2006, 554 had gone overseas. And here's the astonishing thing. A large number actually went to Suriname. My own relatives went to Venezuela and Brazil. So what I'm saying to you is that in one village, right, you can see this sort of isothermal, horizontal kind of connection that is already there at the societal level. It brings us to another point, and this is all of the Guyanas now, that all three of the Guyanas have been outward-looking and have had what I would call a vertical kind of identity. The promise of the Guyana Shield is to begin to build an inward-looking, horizontal identity rather than a vertical identity. That takes time. States can take initiatives that can help this to build these kinds of horizontal relations, but it's a much more involved process. Second-track diplomacy, academics meet, sports teams, we do have the Guyana Games. Tourism, for me, one of the most important things would be a mechanism of building what Durkheim would have called relations of horizontal solidarity. The traders go to Suriname. A lot of Guyanese now live in Suriname. So it's there. The largest minority in Guyana is actually Brazilians. And Guyana labor laws are actually written in Portuguese, in English, of course, and also in Chinese, right? Because there's a significant Chinese population. So what we do know is that this outward-looking, all three, well, I would have to say countries and territory, have had these sort of vertical connections. I think our job is to find the way through scholarship, through business contacts, through elite interaction, and through travel tourism to facilitate a greater awareness of the shared values, the shared history, and the common aspirations that are there. Oil did not come up very much in this conversation, and I'm a little bit surprised about that. It should. Well, I want to couple it with the remark about low-carbon development strategy. I spent a year in Guyana, and actually one of my tasks was to go around and deliver talks about the benefits of low-carbon development strategy and a green economy. And I was actually struck by how interested people were in this. You know, it's very hard to go and tell trade union members that low-carbon development strategy will help them. They want to know more about, you know, wage levels and working conditions and so on and so forth. But the interest was there. It is still there. Here's what I've been thinking about. The Norway mechanism is brilliant in many ways, not least because the funding gets mediated through a third party. I know there are a lot of issues with that, and I share those concerns. Especially having worked with the World Bank on University of Guyana project for the past 6 or 7 years. But would it be possible that a form of public financing, that some kind of a fund is set up, instead of Norway, that the corporation does it, set up a fund that would dedicate it to low carbon development, leaving a lower, you know, carbon footprint. And a lot of it would be educational. And so this is one thing I want to comment. Avoided deforestation is the most economical way of tackling climate change and actually building a sustainable economy. And finally, I do have to say, yesterday in my class, it just so happened by sheer coincidence, we discussed this marvelous document here called Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Here's what I found out. They have 17 goals and 169 targets. About 3/4 of them, right, are directly relevant to the Guyana Shield. And so I think I see a great promise here. And finally, not least because it's very hard to explain to someone that you're from South America, but not quite, that you're from the Caribbean, but not quite, and how do you spell Guyana is a very confusing kind of thing. So here's what I want to suggest. The Guyana Shield also has tremendous symbolic value, and men and women live not only by material things, we also live in and through symbols. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. It was very helpful, including bringing up the societal level of this discussion. Jason?
Sure. Thank you very much. I too want to thank CSIS for the opportunity to come and speak on this topic and of place I've spent a lot of my career working with in Guyana, and also the previous panelists for some very thought-provoking, and members of the audience, interjections. I most recently was in Guyana for the last year, assisting them to become members of EITI, with the oil issue looming very large on the horizon. And prior to that, I did a short-term assignment for the Carter Center with the elections in 2015. But my relationship with Guyana goes back to the 1990s. The first time I heard of the Guyana Shield concept was then in the 90s, coming out of the environmental community. And I just want to mention two others. Conservation International and the Iroquois Rainforest Preserve played a critical role in the development and as a sort of global example of what conservation could look like, and different mechanisms for that. And there's been a lot of sharing of experiences among that community across those countries, particularly Guyana and Suriname, that the easiest thing to do is build from success. And that's probably a success model that deserves a little bit more consideration as part of thinking about the Guyana Shield concepts. But I'd like to maybe focus my comments in two areas. One, this sort of the aspirational idea. How does this concept fit into the moral or political imagination of Guyanese and politicians? I had the rare privilege very early in my career of working in Guyana on probably what was the grandmother of all of these strategies we're talking about now, something called the National Development Strategy, which brought together hundreds of Guyanese, led by the private sector, private sector and civil society. It ultimately got endorsed in Parliament by both political parties, which is a very rare thing. President Granger had in his role in the media 20 years ago, had taken considerable interest in it. But what struck me as I was involved in that process was just sort of the continuing nation building that's going on in Guyana, and probably to different degrees in Suriname and as well. They were grappling with the vision of the Guyanese state that they wanted. They're grappling with their own historical legacies, as we all are. And what was interesting is this theme of unifying the country in a psychological, political, but also a geographic and physical sense. It was pointed out that you can't cross from one side or another of this small country without encountering some pretty major physical blocks to doing so. And, you've got to cross rivers, there aren't bridges, you got to do ferries, same thing on the interior, you'll get stuck in a mud hole if you try to go through during certain times of the year. So there's this lack of integration. In the sense of Guyana, it was a struggle with political internal politics. I'll get into that as my second point. But what were some of the things that they began to sort of envisage as far as this national development strategy? Territorial integration just within Guyana was a major part of it. Transportation networks, roads, bridges. But there was that external orientation, and Professor Persaud brings it up. It's there. The perspective, the outlook is one looking to external markets abroad. These are all very small economies, so they don't necessarily look laterally for the economic engine of their growth. They're looking externally for that, and for that purpose, they started to think about what's the role of getting away from traditional exports. Sugar, rice, timber, gold, getting into export processing, tapping new markets. All of those things sort of became part of this attempt to envisage a different possibility. I would argue a process like that, you don't understand what the possibilities are until you start getting people in a room and thinking about this. And it would be a very interesting idea to start seeing that kind of a dialogue and cooperation, not just within the official sectors, but within civil society and the private sectors across these countries, something like a regional Guyana Shield development strategy. And coming out of that initiative, obviously, was the struggle of the thing, how do we preserve our resources for the future generations while still taking advantage of the fact that that's what we have. And out of that came ideas of the low-carbon development strategy, where Guyana would actually receive international compensation for keeping their forests standing rather than cutting them down, and how you use that to invest in indigenous communities, which are the people who live, daily among the resources and protect the resources. I would say too, adding to your comment, is that the movement and the relationships of indigenous peoples and indigenous families across borders is another one that's worth considering. But ultimately, the challenges of envisaging a new future and putting together the mechanisms to realize that, very often it's grounded in what your realities are of today. And one of the things that Guyanese, in their own compelling words, explained to me very early on was the legacy of ethnic politics and colonialism, and what that's bequeathed to the current state and the current polity. And it has made their efforts at national development extremely difficult, and they stated it very unequivocally in that national development strategy that ethnic division in politics was the #1 constraint on their development and what had kept them back. And I think that remains today in each country, how you grapple with the legacies of the past, how you build a cohesive polity that can collectively work together to achieve strategic, aspirational objectives like this. If you look at Guyana's history and a struggle with perceptions of politics being winner-take-all, and a process of ethnic domination, and a process of just one ethnic group, a cycle, if you will, a recurring cycle, with elections of one party lording it over the other, and the inability to come around constitutional reform and reconciliation, especially in the face of oil, becomes one of the most challenging impediments here. I thought Professor Hintzen's comment that could something other than a state-centric perspective or regionalism, be an outlet or a way out of this. I don't know. That's a very interesting, idea to explore. But I think, when I was in Guyana and I spoke to people, I brought up the sort of Game of Thrones idea that winter is coming, right? And that's what oil is. Oil is coming. And the country has only a few years before national elections again, which are going to take place when oil starts flowing. And so the concern of the resource curse, you can do as much as you want on, legal frameworks and sovereign wealth funds and this sort of thing, and joining EITI, all of which is very positive. But fundamentally, what is driving politics? And if there is an underlying ethnic conflict there that is animating that, that's a threat to any of these initiatives. And Suriname as well has its own historical legacies that it's grappling with. Perhaps they're less severe than Guyana. I know that there are Guyanese who sort of look to Suriname as a possible example of how to reorder the political system as well. And so that I put that out there because ultimately all politics is local. And as you're grappling with these aspirational ideas of how we integrate There's also the sort of path dependence the country is on, both economically and politically, and that will ultimately be something that has to be contended with. So.
Thank you, Jason. Scott?
I'd like to start off by thanking CSIS for putting this program on. Michael Montero, definitely appreciated, David Lewis, and George Fauriol. I'd be remiss to say that I do have a daytime job with Smith's Research and Gradings, and I have to say it because my boss is sitting over there. So I just want to make sure I do have a daytime job. I particularly enjoyed the first panel that took place. I found the Guyanese ambassador's comments very interesting. And I take away, I would say, 6 things from today's proceedings, from the first panel and the conversations that we've just had. The winter is coming aspect that my colleague here, Jason, just brought up is incredibly important from the standpoint that global oil companies have come to Guyana, and they're in Suriname, and they're looking in French Guiana. They're not knocking on the door. They're inside the house already. This is a dollar and cents issue. It means that the governments on a national basis, a local basis, and a interregional basis need to take an approach to this issue, because allocation of funds is what people tend to fight over a lot. It goes back to politics being local, but the big point here is the oil money is coming and it's not going to go away. And you have choices to make in the road as to where you want to go with what you do with the oil money. You can end up the Saudis, which is certainly a petro kingdom, a petro oil kingdom. They have Saudi Arabia 2030. It's what is the Saudi economy going to be after oil? Or you can go the way of Equatorial Guinea in Africa, which is a incredibly twisted place on the map, a brutal dictatorship, everything from tales of cannibalism to financing great women's soccer teams. So take your pick as to what you want to do. So oil, its importance to the economy, and its longevity in economic development in this region is quite important. The second thing that came up was tourism. I think Ambassador McDonald mentioned this as an important development area. It's easy for me to remember his name, obviously. But I would say that one of the things that really strikes me with tourism in the Guyanas is, why not a package deal? Why not put a tour that you go to Guyana, Suriname, and Guyane Française? That would be an interesting concept where you hit the 3 Guyanas in one trip. And that leads to my third point, which is the need for infrastructure, roads, harbors, educational system. I have a tendency to read World Bank and IMF reports, which are not the most scintillating material, and I recommend it if anyone has problems sleeping. But the point being, there's a lot of nuggets of information, and one of the ones that comes up repeatedly for Guyana and Suriname is the need to upgrade human capital. That means the educational system. There are job mismatches. There is foreign direct investment coming into both Suriname and Guyana. Let's tap that. But you have to have the educated people to partake in that. And that's how we begin to break down some of the enclave economics that you have an natural resource extraction business, and it doesn't spread out to the rest of the economy with its benefits. It needs to be pulled in. And education is one way of doing it, because if you pull the local population into it and you train them educationally, that's very important as well. Another area where I think there's a commonality, especially with Suriname, and I very much take to heart Ambassador McDonald's comments about watching the water go over the dikes in Suriname. Climate change is a big issue. People in this country may not fully recognize that as such, but if you live in a number of countries, it's not just the Caribbean, Bangladesh. One of the studies I've seen was by 2050, probably about a third of Bangladesh is expected to disappear under the ocean's waters. You've got those issues in Suriname. The dikes were built by the Dutch for a reason. They've been there for a long time. those things become important. So there's a commonality of interest between French Guiana, Suriname, and Guyana in terms of climate change and dealing with the adverse impact that it has. Geopolitics, Professor Hintzen brought that up. Moving away from the Monroe Doctrine, the Caribbean is up for grabs in terms of geopolitics. I don't mean that people should be grabbing the Caribbean, but I mean that you have a very distracted administration here. The Caribbean is not a focus for the U.S. government. Venezuela is, Cuba to some degree, but it gets all kind of fuzzy after that. And part of the reason for it is you have issues with Syria, Iraq, you still have troops in Afghanistan. There are priorities elsewhere that trump the, no pun intended, that trump the interest between the U.S. and the Caribbean. The European Union does offer a lot for the region. It's certainly a capitalistic area in terms of economic philosophy, but it also is democratic. I do believe the European Union is one of the most successful regions on the planet in terms of avoiding war. They've done a great job since 1945. But there's also limitations in Europe as well. The Europeans can be stingy with foreign direct investment, and they certainly can be with foreign aid. And if you're watching what's going on in European politics, there is a backlash to multilateralism and a hunkering or a hankering back to the idea of the Westphalian system of national interest. The last point I'll make is Michael Mantera in the beginning brought up the whole question of turning points. And I think the Caribbean is at a big turning point. And what this means in terms of practical policy is you have to have a vision. And right now, there's a lot of platitudes, there's a lot of interest, there's good discussions on this, but there is no concrete common vision in this region. And there needs to be, because going forward, the challenges are only going to mount. Like I said, as he said, Jason, winter is coming. Yes, it's here, and we need to respond to it. And I think that's one of the big issues the Caribbean faces going forward. I'm done.
Thank you, Scott, for a very concise, robust set of points. We are theoretically, I think, up on time, but why don't we grab a few extra minutes for some questions from the audience. David?
Thank you, and I didn't want to abuse my moderator role before, but on target on the oil, clearly everything having to do with extractive industries, mining, oil, natural gas, it's the 8,000-pound gorilla in the room, and it raises a lot of issues which we mentioned about governance and management capabilities. And when I mean management, I don't just talk, sort of surreal, but real basic public administration management issues. Is there a Ministry of Energy? Is there a Ministry of Mining? Are there regulations and laws and so on to engage global players, not just from the US, as we've seen with Exxon, but Chinese? There's a Russian consortium in mining looking at French Guiana, Total from France. So it's a whole hodgepodge of new players in that. And the second point, critical, which didn't have a chance to mention, but clearly there are infrastructure and transportation asymmetries in all three geographies, not just with each other, but within each other, as we all know. When you go, just moving around is a physical nightmare. Great idea, 3-country tourism, but you're going to get from Guyane to France quicker than you're going to get in between any of the others. So there's some serious challenges there, which clearly something like a Guyana Shield regional cooperation initiative ought to look at, because as we've seen everywhere in the world, infrastructure is the backbone to be able to create any economic growth. So clearly points.
Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And also, I would like to extend my thanks to CSIS for choosing this topic for a discussion today, which I think is a first step to a well, for an academic discussion on the matter. I would like to indicate that I agree with the comments that have been made by my colleague, the Ambassador of Guyana. Now, talking about the topic that has been posed for our discussion today, I do think that the discussion focused on a number of issues. And when we are talking about a topic, we have to be careful that we do not engage ourselves in a politically loaded discussion. As I see it, I think our first point of entry should be to look at the Guyana Shield from an environmental perspective and to see what added value it can bring to the three countries. I have to point to the fact that we are talking about three countries, of which two of them are independent, sovereign countries that have determined their path in terms of their foreign policy, of course, based on their national interests, and as such have engaged into different schemes of sub-regional, regional, and international cooperation. Many of them have been proven to be very successful, and I should say within the sub-regional and regional level, Guyana and Suriname have been cooperating intensively. With French Guiana, of course, we have to consider that French Guiana, we all indicated it up here today, all the speakers, that it's part of the European Union. We collaborate within the context of the ACP, and it has been pretty successful as well in the areas of cooperation that have been commonly determined by the three countries. There are many challenges ahead for the countries, and I do think that when we are looking at those challenges, we should try to focus as to how we want the Guyana Shield to be portrayed as an advantage to the world. And I think that advantage should be looked at from like determining what the geopolitical and geostrategic interests of Guyana Shield would be. Some of it have been discussed up here, and I would like to, I don't have to make a synopsis of it. I think the speaker, Mr. McDonald, just made a couple of them. One would be, for instance, looking at the element of the presence of all the natural resources. Then the element of freshwater resources, tourism is one part of it, forests, but certainly the element of the strategic importance of having the Kourou rocket station up there and the entire strategic interest of having that rocket station up there and having France as a very important country in the Guyana Shield. Of course, we have to look at the politics of proximity, and that is having major players as our neighbors, Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, and many other countries. So my recommendation would be that when we are going to outline the next steps, that we approach the theme as something that would be an added value to look at it from a geopolitical and geostrategic interest and not merely the environmental. Thank you.
Let me actually thank the ambassador for those comments. The fact that they take place in a place called the Center for Strategic International Studies resonates very, very well. You're pointing, in fact, at a set of observations that make the argument that the Guyana Shield concept is something to be taken seriously, in part because you can make that argument, and some of the comments by the three panelists sort of build into that, let alone the first panelists. And I think it's actually maybe a good place to end, because you're inviting what ultimately we should be doing next, which is to think about this essentially really at two different levels. One of them is the case that's being made at the geostrategic level, and the various actors that can participate in that discussion and will participate in that discussion, and highlights the importance of what this is all about. And secondly, all the way back to Randy's earlier comment that there's also, if you will, the community, the individual aspirational aspects of Guyana Shield that also needs to be, from the bottom up, if you will, need to be taken into account. Let me close by saying that CSIS took up the challenge of this subject matter in association with a number of people in this room, in part because we think that it's a significant one, as was just mentioned a moment ago, in an environment where notions of cooperation, if not integration, at least cooperation, and ultimately trying to, I'll sound maybe a bit wishy-washy here, to trying to do good, to do something useful and helpful, I think is important, and this is really just only the first step. We're entering a new year in a couple weeks. I can only say that CSIS is committed to Caribbean policy issues, and this is actually, the Guyana Shield is an important component of that. So stay tuned and see you all next year. Thank you very much.